30 years after she was abducted and murdered by a serial killer, state police were confident they would finally find the remains of Sarah Ann Wood. This case shook families everywhere. The 12-year-old was riding her bike on a rural road near her Frankfort home when her abductor kidnapped and murdered her. Acting on new information on the case, last Saturday, state police began a 3-day search in Pownell, Vermont, near the borders of New York and Massachusetts on the way to the Berkshires. Over 80 state police, forest rangers, Vermont State Police searched for her remains. After finding no evidence, they called it off yesterday. Sarah was last seen in August of 1993. While Louis Lent confessed to kidnapping and murdering Sarah, he never revealed where he buried her. He's serving a life sentence.
The rural silence of Route 171 in Litchfield, New York, on August 18, 1993, held a deceptively peaceful quality that would soon become the backdrop for one of the most haunting disappearances in the state's history. Sarah Ann Wood, a 12-year-old girl whose life was anchored by her faith and her family, was finishing her day at a vacation Bible school at the Norridge Corners Presbyterian Church, where her father, Robert Wood, served as the pastor. Sarah was a child who embodied the innocence of the early 90s, a cheerleader, a singer, and a girl whose obedience was so well known that her parents never had reason to worry about her traveling the short distance between the church and their home. That afternoon, around 2:30 p.m., she climbed onto her turquoise bicycle for a commute that should have taken less than 5 minutes. The stretch of road she traveled was a mere 2,000 feet, a distance so short it seemed impossible for anything to go wrong. Yet within this narrow window of time and space, Sarah vanished. The thinking behind the investigation begins the moment her father, Pastor Robert Wood, realized she hadn't arrived home. When he went out to look for her, he didn't find a child who had fallen or lost track of time. He found her turquoise bicycle abandoned on the shoulder of Route 171, roughly halfway between the church and the house. To a seasoned investigator, the positioning of the bike was the first chilling clue. It hadn't been crashed or struck by a car. It was found standing or leaned carefully against the brush, suggesting that Sarah had either stopped for someone she recognized or had been intercepted by a predator who used a con or a blitz to neutralize her before she could even drop the bike in a struggle. This indicates a high level of predatory confidence. The abductor was comfortable enough to stop on a public road, engage a victim, and complete an abduction in a window of less than 10 minutes. The absence of skid marks or signs of a physical altercation pointed to a swift, silent transition from the bicycle to a vehicle. The immediate response was a massive mobilization of local and state resources, turning the quiet hamlets of Litchfield and Frankfort into a command center for the New York State Police. Hundreds of volunteers moved shoulder to shoulder through the dense summer undergrowth, while K-9 units and helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the Adirondack foothills. From a forensic perspective, the initial search was a race against the clock, but it was hampered by the environmental limitations of 1993. There were no digital footprints, no cell tower pings, and no surveillance cameras to track the flow of traffic on Route 171. The victimology of Sarah Wood made the case even more baffling. She was a low-risk victim with no history of running away and no problematic associations. This forced investigators to confront the most difficult scenario in criminal justice: a predatory stranger abduction where the killer and victim had no prior link. As days turned into weeks, the analytical focus shifted toward the geographic vulnerability of the abduction site. While Route 171 was a public road, it possessed specific blind spots where the trees and the curve of the road obscured the view from nearby houses. A predator, likely one who had been hunting or scouting the area, would have recognized this gap in visibility. Reports of a suspicious tan or blue sedan in the vicinity began to surface, but without a license plate or a clear description of the driver, the leads were agonizingly thin. The police began the grueling task of interviewing every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius, but the man they were looking for was not on their immediate radar. He was a ghost in the system, someone who operated across jurisdictional lines, exploiting the linkage blindness that often occurs when crimes are committed in different counties or states. Throughout the autumn of 1993, the Wood family's resilience became a focal point for the community. Robert and Frances Wood maintained a balance of public plea and private grief, refusing to let Sarah's name fade from the headlines. Yet, despite the thousands of man-hours and the emotional outpouring of a town under siege, the physical evidence began and ended with that turquoise bicycle. The case was cooling, not for lack of effort, but because the perpetrator had been tactically perfect in his choice of location and timing. The investigation hit a wall of silence that would remain unbroken for nearly 6 months, leaving a predator emboldened by his success and a family trapped in a permanent state of not knowing. The first chapter of Sarah Wood's story concludes in this void, a small-town mystery that seemed destined to become a cold case until a catastrophic mistake by a monster in Massachusetts finally forced the truth into the light. The transition from the frantic urgency of August 1993 to the somber, stretching silence of the following autumn marked a grueling evolution in the disappearance of Sarah Ann Wood. As the lush greens of the Herkimer County landscape faded into the brittle ambers of October, the search for the 12-year-old girl shifted from a rescue mission to a psychological endurance test. In the thinking of professional investigators, this is often the most dangerous phase, the period where linkage blindness sets in and the trail begins to freeze over. The community of Litchfield, once defined by its open doors and pastoral peace, found itself trapped in a state of suspended grief. The yellow ribbons tied to the trees along Route 171 grew weathered and frayed, yet they remained as territorial markers of a town that refused to concede to the darkness that had snatched the pastor's daughter in broad daylight. From an analytical perspective, the investigation during these months was forced to pivot toward a deeper evaluation of behavioral patterns. Because the abduction at the 2,000-foot gap on Route 171 was so surgically efficient, the New York State Police and the FBI began to move away from the local resident theory toward the more terrifying profile of the transient predator. This is an offender who possesses a high degree of forensic awareness, someone who understands that the lack of a crime scene is their greatest weapon. Investigators meticulously dissected the victimology of Sarah Wood. She was the quintessential low-risk victim, a girl with no secrets, no rebellious streaks, and no reason to run away. In criminal profiling, when a low-risk victim is taken in such a clean manner, it almost always points to a high-risk offender, someone who has likely done this before and has refined their method to a point of terrifying precision. The investigative noise during this period was overwhelming. Thousands of tips flooded the hotline, ranging from sightings of tan and blue sedans to frantic reports of suspicious men seen in grocery stores 50 miles away. Each lead was a potential breakthrough, yet each resulted in a dead end. Detectives worked through a massive grid of registered sex offenders, interviewing hundreds of men within a multi-county radius. However, the man they were looking for was not yet a name in their files. He was a ghost in the system, a predator who exploited the jurisdictional gaps between New York and Massachusetts. This linkage blindness is often what allows serial offenders to flourish. Without a centralized digital database in 1993, the connection between a missing girl in Litchfield and an unsolved case in a neighboring state remained invisible to those on the ground. Amidst this investigative vacuum, the Wood family became a pillar of stoic resilience that captivated the national media. Robert and Frances Wood did not retreat into their shadows. Instead, they turned their private agony into a public mission. By establishing the Sarah Ann Wood Trust, they ensured that Sarah's face remained on television screens and in newspapers long after the search parties had disbanded. This was a strategic necessity as much as an emotional one. In cases of stranger abduction, keeping the victim's identity alive in the public eye is the only way to pressure a perpetrator or jog the memory of a witness who may have seen something seemingly insignificant. The Woods' faith-driven dignity provided a stark contrast to the predatory evil that had visited their doorstep. turning Sarah into Central New York's daughter and creating a collective sense of protective vigilance across the state. As the first snows of 1993 began to bury the Adirondack foothills, the physical search for Sarah's remains became an impossibility. The ground hardened, and the dense woods where she might have been hidden were cloaked in a white shroud. For the investigators, this winter was a period of quiet, clinical desperation. They revisited every witness statement, looking for a detail that might have been overlooked, a specific license plate fragment, a description of a driver's glasses, or a report of a vehicle that didn't belong in the rural landscape. They began to look at similar unsolved cases across the Northeast, including the 1990 disappearance of Jimmy Bernardo in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Though the victims differed in gender, the modus operandi, a swift, opportunistic snatching of a child, began to emerge as a haunting common thread in the minds of the FBI profilers. The town of Litchfield, meanwhile, underwent a permanent cultural shift. The stranger danger that had once been a distant, abstract concept was now a local reality. Parents who once allowed their children to bike freely between homes now enforce strict, eyes-on policies. The carefree nature of rural childhood had been replaced by a sharp-edged caution. Every passing car was scrutinized. Every unfamiliar face was met with a gaze of suspicion. The community was in a state of collective trauma, unable to mourn because there was no body, and unable to move forward because the mystery of Route 171 remained an open wound. The investigation was at a standstill, waiting for the predator to make a mistake that would not occur in the woods of New York, but in a parking lot 60 miles away under the neon lights of a Massachusetts winter. Part 2 ends with the silence of the snow, a silence that held the secret of Sarah's fate, waiting for a monster to finally step back into the light. The frozen silence of the 1993 winter was finally shattered on January 7, 1994, not by a breakthrough in New York, but by a desperate struggle for survival 60 miles away in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. 12-year-old Rebecca Savarese was walking to school in the early morning darkness when a man in a beat-up vehicle pulled alongside her. He attempted the same blitz maneuver that had likely been used on Sarah Wood, a swift, overwhelming grab designed to neutralize a child before they could scream. But Rebecca fought back with a ferocity that the predator had not anticipated. In a moment of extraordinary courage, she managed to leap from his moving car and flag down a passing motorist. Her escape was the first crack in the wall of a serial predator's operational security, and the man arrested shortly thereafter was a 43-year-old local janitor named Louis Lent Jr. From an analytical standpoint, the arrest of Louis Lent was the lucky break that years of traditional police work had failed to produce. When investigators searched Lent's vehicle and home, they didn't find the profile of a disorganized loner. They found the toolkit of a meticulous serial kidnapper. They discovered handcuffs, ropes, and a go-bag designed for rapid abductions. More importantly, Lent's physical appearance, unremarkable, average, a man who worked as a janitor and moved invisibly through the community, matched the banality of evil profile that often characterizes long-term predators. The analytical thinking of the Massachusetts State Police and the New York State Police immediately converged. They realized that Lent's habits, his frequent travels across state lines for work and scouting, and the vehicle he drove made him a prime candidate for the unsolved cases of Jimmy Bernardo and Sarah Wood. The interrogation of Louis Lent was a psychological chess match that required investigators to balance aggression with a calculated empathy to draw out a confession. Initially, Lent was stoic, maintaining the persona of a misunderstood man. However, as evidence from the Rebecca Savarese case mounted and investigators began to present him with details from the Sarah Wood disappearance, his composure began to fray. In the thinking of the interrogators, they needed to make Lent feel that confessing was his last way to exert control over the situation. By mid-1994, the pressure of multiple jurisdictions closed in on him. Lent finally broke his silence, but what he offered was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a clinical, chillingly detailed account of the afternoon of August 18, 1993. Lent's confession confirmed the darkest theories that New York State Police had held since finding the turquoise bicycle. He admitted to driving down Route 171 and spotting Sarah on her bike. He described how he lured her toward his car, utilizing a con by asking for directions or help, and then forced her inside. This detail validated the analytical blitz theory. Sarah hadn't been snatched while riding. She had been tricked into a moment of vulnerability. Lent confessed to the unthinkable that within a short time of taking her, he had murdered the 12-year-old girl. His description of Sarah was hauntingly specific, noting her fear and her pleas, details that served as a cruel confirmation for the investigators that they were dealing with a man devoid of genuine human empathy. The confession turned the Sarah Wood case from a missing persons investigation into a homicide recovery mission, but it also revealed a new layer of complexity. Lent claimed he had disposed of Sarah's body in a remote area of the Adirondack Mountains, specifically near the Silver Lake Wilderness or the Moffett Beach area. Analyzing Lent's confession required a skeptical eye. Serial killers often use the location of remains as a final bargaining chip or a way to prolong their interaction with authorities. He provided maps and descriptions that were just vague enough to be frustrating, yet just specific enough to be plausible. He spoke of the place where the trees meet the water, a description that could apply to thousands of acres in the vast, rugged terrain of the North Country. This phase of the story highlights a grim reality in true crime investigations. A confession is often only the beginning of a new kind of torture for the family. While the Wood family finally had a name for the monster who took their daughter, they still lacked the one thing they needed for closure: Sarah herself. The analytical focus shifted from who did it to where is she. Louis Lent had been unmasked, but he remained the gatekeeper of Sarah's final resting place. He had successfully transitioned from an invisible predator to a convicted murderer, but he continued to hold the Woods hostage with his shifting stories and fading memories. The silence of Route 171 had been replaced by the tactical silence of a man in a prison cell, who seemed to take a perverse pleasure in watching the state expend millions of dollars searching for a girl he had buried in the shadows of the mountains. As Part 3 concludes, the narrative moves from the interrogation room to the unforgiving wilderness of the Adirondacks. The confession had provided the what and the who, but the where remained a shifting target. Louis Lent had been sentenced to life without parole for the kidnapping of Rebecca Savarese and the murder of Jimmy Bernardo, with the Sarah Wood charges looming over him. But for the investigators and the Wood family, the legal victory felt hollow without the recovery of Sarah's remains. The monster was behind bars, but Sarah was still out there, lost in the woods, and the true test of the investigation and the family's faith was only just beginning. The focus of the investigation now shifted from the sterile environment of the interrogation room to the unforgiving vast expanse of the Adirondack Park. With Louis Lent's confession came a geographical challenge that would test the limits of forensic science and human endurance. Lent had provided a general area for Sarah Wood's final resting place, a wooded region near the Moffett Beach State Campground in the town of Lake Pleasant. However, translating a killer's hazy, self-serving memories into a successful recovery operation in a 6-million-acre wilderness proved to be a Herculean task. The thinking behind the recovery mission had to account for the landscape of time, the reality that the forest floor of 1993 had been buried under years of decay, new growth, and shifting topsoil by the time the search teams arrived in force. Analytically, the search strategy was a masterclass in forensic archaeology and coordination. The New York State Police, joined by forensic experts and specialized search and rescue teams, utilized every tool in the modern arsenal. They deployed ground-penetrating radar, GPR, to detect soil disturbances that might indicate a clandestine grave, and specialized K-9 units trained specifically in detecting ancient remains, cadaver dogs. The challenge was twofold. First, the acidic soil of the Adirondacks is notorious for accelerating the decomposition of organic matter, potentially leaving little to no skeletal evidence. And second, Louis Lent proved to be an incredibly unreliable guide. In what profilers call the control game, serial predators often use the location of remains as a tether to the outside world. By providing vague or shifting coordinates, Lent ensured he remained relevant, frequently being moved from prison to the woods to assist in the search, a tactic that allowed him a temporary reprieve from his cell and a final, cruel sense of power over the Wood family. Throughout the mid to late 1990s and into the early 2000s, multiple massive search operations were launched. The investigators focused on a specific dump site profile, areas within a short walking distance from logging roads or hidden pull-offs, where a man could carry a small body without being seen. They meticulously gridded miles of terrain near Route 8 and the Silver Lake Wilderness. Every depression in the earth was probed. Every suspicious mound of dirt was excavated by hand with the precision of an archaeological dig. Yet, the Adirondacks are a living, breathing entity. A sapling in 1993 was a sturdy tree by 1996, and the landmarks Lent claimed to remember, a specific fallen log, a certain rock formation, were often lost to the natural cycles of the forest or simply did not exist outside of his imagination. The psychological toll on the search teams was immense. Many of the state troopers and volunteers had daughters Sarah's age. For them, this wasn't just a cold case, it was a moral obligation. They worked through brutal heat, swarms of black flies, and the crushing disappointment of empty excavations. From an investigative standpoint, the failure to locate Sarah led to a troubling question. Was Lent lying? Some profilers argued that Lent, a meticulous, organized killer, would have known exactly where he placed her, and his failure to point to the spot was a deliberate act of psychological sadism. Others suggested spatial memory decay, that the trauma and the passage of time had genuinely blurred his recollection of a crime that to him was just one of many dark impulses he had acted upon. Despite the lack of a body, the thinking of the prosecution was clear. They had enough to move forward with a homicide charge. In a rare legal move, Lent was eventually charged and convicted of Sarah's murder without her remains ever being found. A no-body conviction made possible by his detailed, corroborated confession and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of his predatory history. While this provided a measure of legal justice, it offered no peace to the Wood family. The Adirondack Wilderness remained a vast, silent tomb, and Sarah remained a missing person in the hearts of those who loved her. The search efforts were eventually scaled back, transitioning from active, large-scale operations to periodic assessments based on new leads or technological advancements. As Part 4 concludes, the narrative enters a long, painful plateau. The case of Sarah Ann Wood had become a cornerstone of New York criminal history, but it was a story without a final period. The monster was in a cage, the maps were drawn and redrawn, and the forest continued to guard its secrets. The Wood family was left in a state of ambiguous loss, a psychological condition where the lack of a body prevents the normal stages of grief from completing. They were forced to live in a world where their daughter's killer was known. Her fate was certain, yet her resting place remained a mystery, hidden somewhere beneath the pines and granite of the North Country. The final chapter of the Sarah Ann Wood saga is not defined by a discovery, but by the closing of a tomb that remains tragically empty. The legal resolution of the case began in 1996, when Louis Lent Jr. was brought before a judge in Herkimer County to answer for the murder of the girl whose bicycle he had left on the side of Route 171 3 years prior. In a calculated move by the prosecution, a plea deal was reached, a deal with the devil, born of investigative necessity. Lent would plead guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for the removal of the death penalty, which had been recently reinstated in New York. The strict condition was that he must lead authorities to Sarah's remains. This strategy prioritized the recovery of a child over the execution of a monster, valuing the Wood family's need for a proper burial above the ultimate retributive strike of the law. Analytically, This legal maneuver was a high-stakes gamble that ultimately failed to pay its full dividends. While the plea secured a conviction and ensured Lent would never see the outside of a prison cell again, the recovery aspect of the agreement became a decades-long exercise in psychological warfare. Lent provided more maps and more descriptions, yet each lead dissolved into the vast, indifferent wilderness of the Adirondacks. From a behavioral standpoint, Lent had successfully manipulated the legal system to save his own life while retaining the one thing the state could not take from him, the secret of Sarah's location. He became a permanent fixture in the New York correctional system, a man who would spend the next 30 years in maximum security facilities, occasionally surfacing in the news whenever a new search technology promised a breakthrough that never came. The timeline of the case reached its definitive conclusion on January 1, 2025. Louis Lent Jr., age 74, died of natural causes while in the custody of the New York Department of Corrections. For the investigators who had spent their entire careers chasing his shadows through the North Country, and for the Wood family, his death represented a final door slamming shut. With Lent's death, the primary source of information, however unreliable, vanished forever. In cold case dynamics, the death of a perpetrator usually signals the end of the investigative phase and the beginning of the forensic legacy phase. Any future discovery of Sarah Wood will now depend entirely on environmental shifts or random discovery by a hiker, rather than a confession. The maps Lent drew in the 90s are now frozen artifacts, their accuracy destined to remain unverified. The death of the predator brought a strange, somber peace to central New York. While there was no final walk home for Sarah, there was the relief that the man who haunted the dreams of a generation was finally gone. However, the lack of a body remains a sharp, stinging reality. In the eyes of the law, the case is closed. In the eyes of the community, it is a permanent part of the local lore, a cautionary tale of lost innocence and the limits of justice. The thinking behind the family's journey is perhaps the most profound part of the case. Robert and Frances Wood did not allow the disappearance of their daughter to be defined solely by the evil of her abductor. Instead, they became instrumental in changing how society protects children. The case served as a catalyst for legislative pushes and community awareness programs that revolutionized child safety in rural areas, ensuring that Sarah's name would be associated with protection rather than just loss. The true conclusion of this story lies in the enduring grace of the Wood family. Robert Wood, as a pastor, was forced to reconcile the concepts of forgiveness and justice. He famously spoke about the need to let go of the bitterness that could consume a family, choosing instead to focus on the 12 years of joy Sarah provided. This spiritual resilience turned Sarah from a missing person into a symbol of light. She is remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived as a girl who sang, who cheered, and who loved her community. As of 2026, Sarah Ann Wood remains technically missing, though her death is a matter of legal and historical fact. The New York State Police still maintain her file, and every few years, a new generation of investigators looks at the old maps of the Moffett Beach area with fresh eyes. Technology continues to evolve, and perhaps one day, advanced soil analysis or satellite imaging will reveal a disturbance that was missed in the 1990s. Until then, Sarah belongs to the Adirondacks. The 2,000-foot gap on Route 171 is no longer just a stretch of asphalt. It is a place of remembrance. The turquoise bicycle is long gone, but the lesson it left behind remains. Sarah's story serves as a reminder that even in the safest of harbors, darkness can visit. But it also proves that a family's love and a community's resolve can outlast the lifespan of any monster. The case of Sarah Wood is a story of a search that never truly ends, a mystery that remains etched into the granite of the New York wilderness, and a testament to a girl whose song was silenced too soon, but whose voice still echoes in the laws and hearts of the people who refuse to forget her.